I talk a lot. I am very content not being up here preaching all the time. I'm content. I grew up running the soundboard, always stayed in the back. And so when we did this wild greeting time in the middle, it was a little tough to handle, because all of a sudden here were all these people that I didn't necessarily know. But after being here for several years, it's something that I really enjoy, and we do it as a way to initiate friendships and relationships within the congregation. Because otherwise we may talk and see each other, we don't necessarily get to spend time together. So we do it right in the middle so that you can't really escape. How about that? Drives the introverts crazy, extroverts love it. They're like saying, let's have some. And we have a mix of both here. Hey, if you have your Bibles, we're going to be in the Gospel of Matthew today, Matthew chapter 18. And we're going to talk about a story that I already alluded to. It's one that you know. Brian talked about it with our kids, and we're talking a little bit about, well, we're talking a lot today, about how Christ's love changes us. And there are many different passages that we can use, but one I love is this one right here, Matthew chapter 18. Christ's love really changes us. And this makes sense, because if we love someone and we spend time with them, they have an impact in our life, and we have an impact in their life. And so as we spend time in Christian meditation, we spend time in prayer, we spend time using our life and all the resources that God has given us to benefit the kingdom of God, and we spend time studying God's Word, we are changed. And here is this awesome passage in Matthew 18, starting with verse 1. At that time, the disciples came to Jesus and asked, "Who is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven?" He called a little child and had him stand among them, and he said, "I tell you the truth, unless you change and become like little children, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. Therefore, whoever humbles himself like this child is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. And whoever welcomes a little child like this in my name welcomes me." If you were to read this in Mark, and we have Mark up there, and since you have it, Mary, I'll go ahead and read it.
Oh, all right.
I'll just read it out there.
Okay.
Here's the version that Mark has recorded for us. They came to Capernaum when he was in the house. He asked them, "What were you arguing about on the road?" But they kept quiet because on the way they had argued about who was the greatest. Sitting down, Jesus called the 12 and said, "If anyone wants to be first, he must be the very last and the servant of all." He took a little child and had him stand among them, and taking him in his arms, he said to them, "Whoever welcomes one of these little children in my name welcomes me, and whoever welcomes me does not welcome me, but the one who sent me." Little different take compared Matthew to Mark. In Matthew, we have the disciples saying, "Hey, Jesus, who is greatest in the kingdom of heaven?" It looks like the disciples are bringing it up, and they're saying, "Hey, Jesus, we've got this question. Who's the greatest in the kingdom of heaven?" But in Mark, we get a slightly different perspective of how the story unfolded. We have Jesus and the disciples traveling, and on the way, the disciples are arguing amongst themselves about who is greatest in the kingdom of heaven. It's interesting with my kids, and especially Allie, how she'll present stuff to us. Because she may tell me one way, and she'll tell Jen a slightly different way. And so usually between the two of us, we get a really good picture of what's going on. And so looking at these two accounts, we get the feeling that as the disciples were traveling with Jesus, there was this ongoing discussion as to who was the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. Now, I am pretty certain, although it doesn't tell us, I am pretty certain that they thought the answer was one of them. As you listen to the context, as you read this, is what's going on. They were pretty sure that greatest in the kingdom of heaven, it was going to be one of the 12. I mean, Jesus, and then one of the 12. You know, and when we go to Matthew, the disciples can't solve it on their own, so they come up to Jesus and they ask. It's a little bit softer take on the disciples. It lets them say just a little bit of face in this. And let's be honest, we can all appreciate that, because at times we've all put our foot in our mouths and said something that maybe we shouldn't have said, or been talking about something that we shouldn't have talked about. And when somebody catches us in it, maybe they call us on the carpet, or they they give us a little bit of grace here. And I love that in this account of Matthew, they're given just a little bit of grace. Regardless if you take Matthew's account or if you look at Mark's account, Jesus' answer is very similar in both. In fact, it's kind of strange in both. Is this the answer that you would have expected? It's not the answer that I would have expected. I mean, I grew up in the church, I know the story, I know how it ends, but from a logical conversation standpoint, the one who is the greatest is usually the one who does the best job. Think employee of the month. Maybe the disciples were kind of lobbying for the position of disciple of the month, disciple of the year. It's hard to say. But when we put it that way, isn't that the way we take stuff? We look at, okay, I'm the best worker here. I was employee of the month. I made it this week. Or I made it this month. I did that. And we look up to that. Jesus doesn't say it's the one who does the most. He doesn't say it's the one who writes the most songs for Jesus. Or it's the one who writes the most books about me. Or it's the one who knows the most information about me. Or the one who wins the most converts for me. It's the one who becomes like a child. That is a strange answer from all human perspective. Because we know how to work and become better. We know how to study, we know and to improve ourselves. We know lots of different ways that we can become great in our world. And when Jesus says, if you want to be greatest in the kingdom of heaven, become like this little child, it stood everything up on its head. This was not the answer that they were expecting for a lot of different reasons. Number one, it's just nobody thinks of the child as being great, right? Nobody thinks of saying, hey, become like a child and you'll have it all together. We typically look at do as much as you can, work the best, get promoted, study, show yourself to be the most valuable employee, get the raises, have the nice stuff, and you will be greatest. But there was another reason. Children were not highly valued. They were valued as having lots of assets, but they weren't recognized as people. They had no rights. They really didn't count for anything. Their entire well-being was at the discretion of the father. In fact, wives and children were seen as property. It was good to have a lot. The more you had, the more you were worth. The more it showed that you had, that you could provide for this many people. And it spoke to your vitality as a man to have a good number of children. And so for Jesus to say, become like a child, made absolutely no sense with what the disciples knew. You want us to become like a piece of property. You want us to become like someone who really doesn't count in all social settings. Now, from the flip side, as we look at this, childhood isn't so bad, right? Because all you have to do is go to school and clean your room. Doesn't sound too bad, right? Sounds like a nice, pretty, easy road. But there's some things about childhood that we can really learn. One of the first, and if you're taking notes today, here's one of the points I'd love for you to remember. When Jesus talks about being childlike, one of the things that I believe he means is to become teachable. Because hopefully children are teachable. Right now, Allie asks all the questions. She asks questions all the time. And I shared with you a couple months ago, about 6 months ago, her world completely collapsed. She said, Daddy, you don't know everything. She's 3.5, by the way. Daddy, you don't know everything. And a long pause.
Who's world collapsed?
I thought you did, but you don't. Not only did her world collapse, so did mine. But to become teachable, to look and to learn and to want to grow, to ask questions. Everything from why is the sky blue to why does that happen, to what are we doing today, to did you make plans for dessert? What are your dessert plans, Daddy? I didn't make any, sweetie. But to become teachable. One of the biggest challenges I think we face as an adult is know-it-all syndrome. You know what that is? if you've never experienced it, or you think you've never experienced it, I bet you know someone who has experienced it, right? You've experienced it, Mylon?
I am though.
You are not. See, I was hoping that we would have a couple people that would say, that's me, or I'm sure that there was a little bit of elbow nudging going on, say, you've done that. But people ask questions and we feel that we should know all of the answer. Little secret, no person has all the answers. No man, no woman, no matter how much they believe that they may, no one person has all of the answers. One of the things that kids do great is ask questions. Sometimes as adults we stop asking questions. We stop looking for new things to learn and ways to grow. We assume that we have amassed enough knowledge to carry us through the rest of our life, however long that may be. But part of becoming like a child is embracing that we have a lot to learn. We have a lot to learn still about ourselves. We have a lot to learn about others. And we have a lot to learn about God. And there are many other things that we have a lot to learn about. There's many ways we can learn. Some of the most popular are to read, right? Ask a friend. Ask somebody who is well qualified in the field. Ask them their experience, their thoughts. Another great one that I use often, Google it. If it's on the internet, it's got to be true, right? Google it. Lots of different ways that we can learn. As a Christian, there's two I'd like you to throw in there. We can pray, and we can listen. Listening is highly underrated these days. We can pray, we can listen. I made a commitment many years ago to become a lifelong learner. I try and read right now about 6 books going on at the same time. Usually within a page I remember exactly where I was. I love to read and to study, and I'll be honest with you, most of my books are church related. It's what I enjoy, it's what I love doing. It benefits you because I learn new stuff, and so I don't preach the same sermons all the time. So you should be excited about that. But I would encourage you as well to take on this idea of being a lifelong learner. And it came out of something that I didn't necessarily expect. I started in my first parish, and as I was working and growing, I realized something. Although I had studied and prepared, I didn't know all the answers. I couldn't do everything that I needed to do, and so I was forced to start to learn and read and talk to people, and it was a humbling reality to say, I don't know everything. It was also very freeing. Now, my wife already knew it. My parents knew it. And I'm pretty sure that most of the congregation knew it. I was the one that had to learn that. And so I made this commitment to becoming a lifelong learner. As children of God, I would encourage you to become lifelong learners. Not just about the Bible, which is a great subject to study, but about all things of creation. Because we learn so much as God works and reveals things in everyday life. I know the trout season started. Yesterday was the second Saturday. I have not made it yet. I love to go trout fishing, not because I enjoy eating trout, not because I necessarily enjoy touching the fish. I do it. I've gotten much better with it. Because I love being out in nature and it being quiet. I love that moment to reflect and to spend time in nature where nothing else is going on. And my main focus is what is happening in the stream. The second thing that we take on as children, the way that we change and to become childlike, is to become dependent on God. Now I want to clarify, this is not codependent, where we sit back and we allow God to do everything for us, or we expect that we're not going to have to lift a finger and God will do everything. We become dependent on God. Children are completely dependent upon parents for food, shelter, care, everything that they need, right? At this age, Allie is just over 4. She does not need me to feed her everything. I'm kind of thankful for that. Alex is still pretty content for us to feed him. He's pretty happy to sit back, open his mouth, and let us do the work for him. And sometimes we're content to do that for him because he doesn't like utensils, he has hands. And so whatever he gets kind of goes everywhere. But to understand that God is really the source for everything that we have in our life. Anytime I think about this, there is a quote that comes back in my mind. It may surprise you that this is one of the quotes that comes back to a pastor's mind, but I remind you that I am human as much as are you. It comes from The Simpsons. It is a scene where the whole family is gathered around the table, and in the midst of the chaos that always seems to happen around the Simpsons table, Homer orders the family to be quiet and to say grace. Bart is nominated to pray, and he prays, "Dear God, we pay for all this stuff, so thanks for nothing." Now that sounds awful, doesn't it?
Yes.
But how often is that our attitude? God, I have worked for this. I studied for this. I planned for this. I cooked this. I will clean up after all of this. And so, God, we say thank you, but it is merely a token thanks. When we become childlike, we realize that yes, we have done stuff, yes, we have worked, yes, we have helped, but God is the source in this, and God has given me these great things. It creates an attitude of thankfulness when we realize that it's not just us that it comes from, that God is the one who gives us these things. We are there with our kids to help love, teach, guide, discipline. Isn't that part of it? How many of us thank God when we encounter discipline in our life? I gotta be honest with you, I'm not there all the time. I don't always enjoy it when I don't get the things that I want. I don't always enjoy it when things don't go my way. It's good for us to not get everything that we want, for us to not have everything go our way, but I don't necessarily enjoy it. And as parents, we know that our children need discipline. They also need the stuff that they can't do on their own. We really don't want a 4-year-old using the stove, right? I don't necessarily want the 4-year-old going through the fridge. You don't know what's going to end up on the floor, whether or not it's going to be closed, all the other things that could happen. We're there to do these things over and over and over again. In the same way, when Christ tells us to become childlike, it reminds us that God is still God, that God is at work in our life, that God is doing stuff that we haven't just arrived, and it is okay to allow God to do those things. And there's this great thing in there that occasionally we need help changing bad habits in our life, or things that aren't healthy for us. Alex's favorite toy, he loves cars, he loves trucks, he loves anything that he can throw, but he also loves the toilet brush. And you cringe, because we all know why, right? No sensible parent would say, "Here, son, have a used toilet brush." In fact, we would encourage our children not to play with stuff like that. It's dirty, it's disgusting, that's potentially harmful. And that is exactly what we have done with Alex. I just cannot bring myself to the point that we buy a spare toilet brush for him to play with. I just can't do it. I think there are some ground rules. You have lots of toys. The toilet brush is not one. At 18 months, he knows he's not allowed, because we've had this conversation over and over and over again. Last week, we kicked him out of the bathroom for playing with the toilet brush. And as we were out in the kitchen, we happened to look back the hallway, and our hallway is not that long, so it wasn't very hard to see him. Here comes Alex strolling out through the hallway, toilet brush in hand. And as Jen sees him, he smiles. We need to be dependent on God even for the things that we know aren't good for us. We still have a lot to learn. That's part of that teachable thing, right? So being teachable and then being dependent on God, allowing God to actually teach us stuff that will be helpful and useful to help us grow throughout our life. And the third part is to become humble. Because as adults, when we feel that we know it all, when we feel that we are the source for all of the good stuff that we have, we really tend to become prideful. To really assume that we have done all this, we have earned it, it is owed to us because of the stuff that we have done. And there is this real sense of pride that can develop. It is hard to be prideful when you are still teachable and you are dependent on God. And so as we talk about becoming humble, we need to go back and to remember that we live in a very different society from the disciples in the first century church. For us, humility has really become a benchmark of the Christian faith. It is something that we value. We see the way that Christ demonstrated humility, the way that Christ lived and served. And one of the passages that, if you're familiar at all with the scriptures, is probably Jesus washing the disciples' feet. This great act of humility where Jesus gets down, he takes the role of a servant, and he washes the feet of the disciples. And remember, we live in a very different society that did not have the indoor plumbing that we do too. There were lots of things you were washing off people's feet. And so here Jesus becomes the servant, humbling himself and serving the rest of the disciples. So for us, humility is this amazing part of life that we really value. In the first century, that's not the case. Nobody wanted to be humble. In fact, the best thing that you could do was to elevate yourself and to make sure that everyone understood all of the accomplishments that you had managed to accumulate. That they understood all of the things that you had done well, and that they knew that you knew other people so that you could raise your social standing. Because if you wanted to be well respected, you weren't humble. You didn't put off talking about certain things because it might seem prideful. If anything, you were filled with pride at the great things you had done. So when Jesus says, become like a child, and in that we take, become humble. Wait a minute. You really want us to become not like the best part of society, the people that we really respect. You want us to become like the people that we tend to ignore? The people who are often seen as property? The people who are often seen that don't count? That is what you're telling us to do. What a strange thing for Jesus to say. And yet, it has taken off as such. Humility went from being something that wasn't valued at all. In fact, most of the time, they really didn't have the kind of humbleness that we talk about, where you lower yourself. They had humiliation where you were put in your place. Big difference. We still don't like humiliation, right? Nobody likes to be humiliated. Nobody likes to be made to feel that they are less than what they think they are. But when we humble ourselves, we do it willingly. We actually make a choice to lower ourselves. And so Jesus is telling the disciples, lower yourself to the state of a child. Not what they signed up for when Jesus called them his disciples. To become someone's disciple, to follow them around, gave you a fast track to recognition in the community. Because you didn't necessarily do all these things on your own. You were elevated to a higher status because of the teacher that you were following. And so when Jesus called them from their position as fishermen and tax collectors, they thought, here is our chance to go from just being normal people to being someone who matters. And so we go all the way forward as Jesus' ministry is progressing. As they're traveling on the road, they have not caught all the stuff that Jesus has done. They haven't really put it together that it's about serving and meeting needs. They are still missing the point and saying, we are on the road to greatness, and I think I'm number one. And so here they are settling this dispute on the road. Looking at all their accomplishments, looking at everything that they had learned in their society as to what makes things great, or what makes someone great. And so when they have this conversation with Jesus, whether they initiated it, which I highly doubt, or Jesus kind of called them on and said, we need to talk, guys. It was not at all what they expected. The reason for this is that Christ's love changes us. It changes the way we live our lives. It changes the way we see ourselves. It changes the way we see the world. Because instead of trying to make ourselves great, Christ says, take on the role of a child. One who learns. One who is okay with being dependent on God. One who is okay with being humble and not making sure that everyone knows how great they think they are. This is a big change. We love our teaching time for the kids, don't we? When the kids come up and we have this little lesson for them. And if we're honest, sometimes we get more out of those lessons than we do in the sermons. We really enjoy those, right? Little things that stick with us that help us to remember and grow. But there's this part of the kids learning and growing and seeing this that's just cute, isn't it? They're fun. They also seem to be so free because they're not bound by the things that we feel we're bound by. They're not afraid to ask. They're not afraid to touch stuff. They're not afraid to potentially say something that someone else might think is stupid. They just ask. As we allow Christ's love to change us, we really become God's children, and I think we become freer. Not that we won't still struggle that we struggle with. Not that we won't have moments like the disciples where we say, Lord God, I'd really like to be great for you. I would really like to know that I'm getting everything right. I'd really like just once to have all the answers. Not that we won't have those moments, not that we won't have those struggles, but it frees us up to not have to have those to feel like we matter. I think perhaps the biggest change that Christ's love does in our life is that it changes the center of our life. We move from being self-centered to Christ-centered. Now here's the deal. If you're not teachable, if you are not dependent upon God, at least recognizing and realizing that God blesses you, and if you are not humble, you are not Christ-centered. It's impossible. Teachable, dependent, humble, Christ-centered. So the question I always ask, where do we go from here? Well, depends on where you're at. It depends on what you're struggling with, what you're thinking about, where God has been at work within your life. Because maybe some of us for the first time say, you know what? I never thought about this. But I've been a lot like the disciples. Well, here's an opportunity to change. Or God, I've really struggled with being like a kid because it doesn't seem like the right thing. Because the first thing that the church really tries to do is to make you grow up and act right? And yet, Christ has become like a child. Which means it is okay to dance and have fun when we sing. Doesn't mean you have to. It means it's okay. It's okay to make mistakes. It's okay to ask questions. It's okay to allow God to correct you when you play with your toothbrush. So where do we go from here? We have a heart-to-heart with God. Say, God, where am I at? You know. I don't necessarily know. Help me to trust you. Help me to learn. Help me to grow. And help me to do this thing that you challenged the disciples with so long ago. Let's pray. Dear God, thank you for today. Thank you for this time together. God, as we just think about this idea of becoming childlike, it really does go against everything that we know and think that we should be. God, help us to learn. Help us to trust you and to realize that you really, really, really are our loving Father. And that you provide things for us that we don't even see. God, help us to trust in you and not ourselves, and in everything that we